Why did Czechoslovakia let Hitler's army march in and seize the Sudetenland without firing a single shot? Was it fear, betrayal, or something even more unsettling? For decades, historians have debated whether this moment marked the true death of peace in Europe, a turning point that set the world on a path to disaster. But behind the headlines and the history books, the real story is far more complicated than most people realize. Imagine waking up to find your country's borders redrawn overnight, your supposed allies turning their backs, and your own people divided over who the real enemy is. That's exactly what happened in September 1938, when German forces rolled into the Sudetenland and the world watched in disbelief as Czechoslovakia stood down. Some called it cowardice. Others saw it as a calculated move to avoid a bloodbath. But the truth is, the decision not to fight was shaped by years of tension, betrayal, and impossible choices. The Sudetenland crisis wasn't just about territory. It was about identity, survival, and the terrifying realization that the rules of the old world no longer applied. So, what really happened behind the scenes? Why did a nation with a strong military and powerful allies suddenly find itself alone, forced to surrender without a fight? To understand the answer, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a country born from the ashes of a fallen empire and a region destined to become the spark that ignited a global conflict. Czechoslovakia didn't exist before 1918. It was carved out of the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of provinces and peoples suddenly thrust together by the chaos of World War I's end. The world powers, eager to redraw the map of Europe, saw an opportunity to create a new democratic state in the heart of the continent. But from the very start, Czechoslovakia was a nation built on fragile foundations. Its borders enclosed not just Czechs and Slovaks, but also Hungarians, Poles, Ruthenians, and, most problematically, over 3 million ethnic Germans living in the mountainous regions along the western and northern edges. These Germans, known as the Sudeten Germans, had once enjoyed privilege and power under the old empire. Now, almost overnight, they found themselves a minority in a country that didn't want them, ruled by people who spoke a different language and followed different customs. The resentment was immediate and deep. In October 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, Sudeten German leaders declared their own independent republic, hoping to join Austria or Germany instead of being absorbed into this new, unfamiliar state. But the Allies ignored their pleas. The post-war settlement forced the Sudetenland into Czechoslovakia, and the German-speaking population was left feeling betrayed and powerless. Tensions flared almost instantly. Czechoslovak troops moved in to assert control, and the Sudeten Germans responded with protests and defiance. In March 1919, violence erupted in the town of Kadaň, where dozens of German demonstrators were killed by government forces. The wounds from these early clashes never truly healed. Instead, they festered beneath the surface, fueling a sense of alienation and injustice that would haunt the new nation for years to come. But the Sudeten Germans weren't the only ones struggling to adapt. The Czechs and Slovaks themselves were trying to build a functioning democracy from scratch, balancing the demands of multiple ethnic groups, each with their own history and grievances. The result was a country constantly on edge, where old loyalties clashed with new realities, and where the seeds of future conflict were sown in the very soil of its creation. And as the world would soon discover, these divisions would prove dangerously easy for outsiders to exploit. But before the storm broke, Czechoslovakia would experience a brief, fragile period of stability, one that masked the deep cracks running through its foundation. The Sudetenland wasn't just a border region. It was a world apart, a place where language, culture, and memory collided every single day. For centuries, the Sudeten Germans had lived in these rugged mountains and rolling hills, building towns, running factories, and shaping the local economy. Under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they'd held positions of influence. Their language, Spoken in government offices and schools, their traditions woven into the fabric of daily life. But after 1918, everything changed. Suddenly, the Sudeten Germans were no longer the favored elite. They were a minority, their voices drowned out by the new Czech and Slovak majority. The government in Prague tried to ease the transition. German was made an official language, and German schools were allowed to operate. But these gestures felt hollow to people who had lost so much so quickly. The bitterness ran deep. Many Sudeten Germans saw themselves as victims of a political deal made in distant capitals, their fate decided without their consent. When they tried to declare their own republic in 1918, hoping to join Austria or Germany, their efforts were ignored by the world's leaders. Instead, Czechoslovak troops marched in, determined to keep the new country together at any cost. The result was a tense and uneasy peace, punctuated by moments of violence and protest. In towns like Kadaň, German demonstrators clashed with soldiers, and blood was spilled in the streets. These early confrontations left scars that would never fully heal, fueling a sense of injustice that simmered beneath the surface for years. Politically, the Sudeten Germans found themselves isolated. In the first local elections, an overwhelming majority voted for German nationalist candidates, sending a clear message that they did not accept their new status. But in the halls of power, their influence was limited. The Czech and Slovak parties dominated the government, and decisions about land, industry, and education often left the Sudeten Germans feeling sidelined. Even as the government tried to integrate them, resentment only grew. Many Sudeten Germans clung to their old identity, refusing to see themselves as part of the new Czechoslovak state. They spoke German at home, celebrated their own holidays, and looked longingly across the border to Austria and Germany, where they believed their true future lay. This sense of division wasn't just political, it was personal. Families were split, friendships strained, and communities divided by suspicion and mistrust. The Sudetenland became a land of quiet resistance, where every government policy was met with skepticism and every attempt at unity was shadowed by memories of loss. As the years passed, these divisions would only deepen, setting the stage for the explosive events that would soon follow. But for now, the Sudeten Germans waited, watching and hoping for a chance to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. And as the world outside grew more unstable, it was only a matter of time before someone would come along, promising to restore their pride and power, no matter the cost. Despite the deep divisions simmering beneath the surface, the 1920s brought a surprising period of stability to Czechoslovakia. While much of Europe was rocked by political chaos and economic collapse, this new nation managed to carve out a reputation as a rare success story. The government, a patchwork of coalitions made up of socialists, conservatives, and moderates, managed to pass power peacefully from one group to another. A remarkable achievement in an era when coups and dictatorships were becoming the norm. The country's economy, too, rebounded quickly from the devastation of World War I. Inheriting a wealth of industry from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechoslovakia became one of the most industrialized states in Central Europe, with factories humming and cities growing. But beneath this surface prosperity, old wounds festered. The government's ambitious land reforms, designed to break up the estates of the old aristocracy and redistribute land for agriculture and industry, hit the Sudeten Germans especially hard. Many of the largest estates and factories had been owned by German families for generations, and now they watched as their property was seized and handed over to others. The sense of loss and injustice only deepened, fueling resentment that no amount of economic growth could erase. Politically, the Sudeten Germans remained on the outside looking in. While German nationalist parties were technically allowed to participate in elections, their voices were easily drowned out by the Czech and Slovak majority, who had little interest in addressing German grievances. Foreign policy added another layer of tension. Determined to protect itself from threats on all sides, Czechoslovakia forged alliances with France, Romania, and Yugoslavia, creating a network of mutual defense that was meant to deter aggression from Hungary or Germany. On paper, these alliances made Czechoslovakia look strong and secure. In reality, they only served to isolate the Sudeten Germans further. Many saw the country's close ties with France, the very nation that had championed the Treaty of Versailles and the breakup of the old empire, as a direct affront to their identity. Even the alliance with Yugoslavia stung, since many Germans blamed the Serbs for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the war that had destroyed their world. Yet, for a time, the promise of stability seemed to outweigh the pain of the past. By the mid-1920s, some Sudeten Germans began to participate more actively in Czechoslovak politics, hoping to protect their interests from within. German nationalist parties even managed to secure a small place in the coalition government, a sign that perhaps old enemies could learn to coexist. But this fragile peace was always at risk. The economic boom of the 1920s masked the deep divisions that still ran through the country, and the sense of alienation among the Sudeten Germans never truly faded. As the world edged closer to crisis once again, it became clear that Czechoslovakia's stability was built on shaky ground. All it would take was a single spark to set the old resentments ablaze. And that spark was already on the horizon, growing stronger with every passing year. The calm of the 1920s couldn't last forever. As the world slid into the Great Depression, Czechoslovakia's fragile unity began to unravel. Factories slowed, jobs vanished, and the pain hit the Sudeten Germans harder than anyone else. By 1930, nearly half of the country's unemployed were from the Sudetenland. Many believed they were being deliberately shut out of government jobs and contracts, fueling a sense of injustice that was impossible to ignore. In the eyes of the Sudeten Germans, the promises of equality and fair treatment had been broken. Their frustration grew, and with it, the appeal of radical solutions. It was in this climate of despair that extremist politics took root. New organizations sprang up in Sudeten towns, openly calling for autonomy or even separation from Czechoslovakia. The government tried to stamp out these movements, banning separatist parties and cracking down on dissent. But the anger only grew. Into this storm stepped a new and dangerous influence, Adolf Hitler. Across the border in Germany, Hitler's rise to power electrified the Sudeten Germans. He spoke their language, literally and figuratively, denouncing the Treaty of Versailles and promising to protect Germans everywhere, no matter which country they lived in. His speeches were broadcast across the border, and his message found a ready audience among those who felt abandoned and betrayed. The Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, quickly became the voice of this discontent. Unlike earlier groups, Henlein's party was careful not to demand outright independence, at least not at first. Instead, they called for greater autonomy, more rights, and protection for German culture. But beneath the surface, their agenda was clear. They were openly sympathetic to Nazi Germany, echoing its rhetoric on race and national destiny. In the 1935 elections, the Sudeten German Party won a staggering 63% of the Sudeten German vote, a sign that Hitler's influence was spreading fast. Prague watched these developments with growing alarm. The government knew that the Sudetenland was becoming a powder keg, and they scrambled to find new allies. In 1935, Czechoslovakia signed a defensive pact with the Soviet Union, hoping that the threat of Soviet intervention would deter Hitler. But there was a catch. The Soviets would only act if France did first, and no one was sure France would keep its word. Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia began building massive border fortifications, hoping to make any German invasion too costly to attempt. Ironically, these defenses had to be built right in the heart of the Sudetenland, where pro-Nazi sentiment was strongest. The government was literally fortifying itself on ground that was slipping away. As Hitler's power grew, so did the pressure on Czechoslovakia. The Sudeten German Party's demands became more extreme, and their loyalty to Prague faded. The Sudetenland was no longer just a domestic problem. It had become a weapon in Hitler's hands, a pretext for intervention, and a rallying cry for German nationalists everywhere. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Europe to its core. And as the world watched, the question was no longer if a crisis would erupt, but when. As the Sudeten crisis deepened, Czechoslovakia found itself in a desperate race against time, searching for allies who might stand by its side if war broke out. On paper, the country looked well defended. It had treaties with France and the Soviet Union, and its military was among the best equipped in Central Europe. But beneath the surface, these alliances were riddled with uncertainty. The Soviet Union's promise of help came with a dangerous catch. They would only intervene if France did first. And France, still haunted by the horrors of World War I, was growing increasingly reluctant to risk another conflict with Germany. The British, meanwhile, were determined to avoid war at almost any cost, convinced that appeasing Hitler might keep the peace. As rumors of German aggression swirled, Czechoslovakia's leaders realized that, in a true crisis, they might be left to face the storm alone. Determined not to go down without a fight, the Czechoslovak government poured resources into building a line of massive border fortifications. These concrete bunkers and artillery positions were meant to slow any German advance and buy time for their supposed allies to come to the rescue. But there was a cruel irony at play. These defenses had to be built right in the Sudetenland, among a population that was increasingly hostile to Prague and sympathetic to Hitler. The government was fortifying its borders on ground that was already slipping away, and every new bunker was a reminder of just how precarious their position had become. Then, in March 1938, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. German troops marched into Austria in a move known as the Anschluss, and the world barely blinked. The annexation of Austria didn't just expand Hitler's territory, it completely changed the strategic map. Suddenly, Czechoslovakia was surrounded on three sides by German-controlled land, and its vital connection to France was cut off. If war came, help from the West would be nearly impossible to reach. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Even as German officials, like Hermann Göring, offered empty assurances that they had no designs on the Sudetenland, few in Prague believed them. The writing was on the wall, and the message was clear. Czechoslovakia was running out of friends, options, and time. Inside the Sudetenland, the mood was shifting rapidly. The Sudeten German Party, emboldened by Hitler's success in Austria, ramped up its demands for autonomy and began openly calling for unification with Germany. Tensions exploded into violence, with clashes between pro-German activists and Czechoslovak authorities becoming more frequent and deadly. The government's attempts to appease the Sudeten Germans, offering new rights, funding, and promises of fair representation, were met with scorn and escalating demands. It was becoming obvious that no compromise would ever be enough. The Sudetenland was slipping out of Czechoslovakia's grasp, and the world was turning its back, unwilling to risk war for a small country in Central Europe. The stage was set for a betrayal that would shock the world, and for a decision that would haunt Europe for generations. The crisis reached its boiling point in September 1938, when Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland became impossible to ignore. With German troops massing on the border and the Sudeten German Party openly calling for unification with the Reich, the world watched as Europe teetered on the edge of another catastrophic war. But instead of standing firm, Britain and France chose a different path, one that would become infamous in the annals of history. Desperate to avoid another bloodbath like World War I, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders convinced themselves that giving in to Hitler's demands might preserve peace. They believed that the Sudetenland, with its German-speaking majority, was a reasonable sacrifice if it meant avoiding conflict. What they didn't realize was that this act of appeasement would only embolden Hitler and shatter the fragile trust between nations. The Munich Conference was hastily arranged, bringing together Hitler, Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Conspicuously absent from the negotiating table was anyone from Czechoslovakia itself. The fate of an entire nation was being decided behind closed doors, without its leaders even present to defend their country's interests. In a matter of hours, the great powers agreed. The Sudetenland would be handed over to Germany, and Czechoslovakia would be left to pick up the pieces. Chamberlain returned to Britain waving a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." But in Prague, the mood was one of shock, outrage, and betrayal. For the Czechoslovak government, the Munich Agreement was nothing short of a disaster. Their supposed allies had abandoned them, and the message was clear. If they resisted, they would stand alone against the might of the German war machine. The sense of isolation was crushing. Even the Soviet Union, bound by treaty to help, refused to act without France's lead. The people of Czechoslovakia were left with an impossible choice: fight a hopeless war or surrender and hope to survive another day. The Sudeten Germans, meanwhile, celebrated in the streets, welcoming the German troops as liberators. For them, the Munich Agreement was a long-awaited victory. For everyone else, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The Munich Betrayal sent shockwaves across Europe. It exposed the weakness of the Western democracies and showed Hitler that he could achieve his goals through threats and intimidation. The world had turned its back on Czechoslovakia, sacrificing a small nation in the hope of buying peace. But as history would soon reveal, appeasement only fed the appetite of aggression. The Sudetenland was just the beginning, and the true cost of the Munich Agreement would be paid in blood and devastation across the continent. As German troops marched into the Sudetenland without resistance, the rest of Europe was left to wonder, if the world could abandon Czechoslovakia so easily, who would be next? So why didn't Czechoslovakia fight back when German troops crossed into the Sudetenland? On the surface, it's a question that seems to haunt history. A nation with a strong military, modern defenses, and a proud tradition of resistance simply standing aside as its territory was carved away. But the reality was far more complex, shaped by a web of political, military, and social forces that left Czechoslovakia with almost no real options. First, there was the brutal truth about the balance of power. By 1938, Germany's military was not only larger, but also better equipped and more experienced, thanks to years of secret rearmament and aggressive expansion. Czechoslovakia's own army, while formidable on paper, was isolated and surrounded, especially after the Anschluss with Austria. The country's vital supply lines to France were cut, and any hope of outside help had evaporated at Munich. The message from Britain and France was unmistakable. If Czechoslovakia chose to resist, it would be fighting alone. But the military situation was only part of the story. Inside the Sudetenland, the mood was anything but unified. The majority of Sudeten Germans, swept up by years of Nazi propaganda and promises of a better future, actually welcomed the idea of joining Hitler's Reich. For many, the arrival of German troops was not an invasion but a liberation. The Czechoslovak government faced the grim reality that any attempt to defend the region would mean fighting not just the German army, but also risking a civil war with its own citizens. The prospect of bloodshed on such a scale was terrifying, especially when the outcome seemed all but certain. There was also a deep sense of betrayal and futility. The government in Prague had spent years building alliances, fortifying borders, and trying to integrate the Sudeten Germans into the national fabric. But when the crisis came, those efforts counted for nothing. The Western powers, who had once promised to stand by Czechoslovakia, now pressured it to accept the loss of the Sudetenland in the name of peace. The Soviet Union, bound by treaty, refused to act without France. Even the League of Nations, created to prevent exactly this kind of aggression, stood by helplessly. In the face of such overwhelming odds, the Czechoslovak leadership made a painful calculation. To fight would mean certain destruction, not just for the army, but for the entire country. In the end, the decision not to fight was a desperate attempt to save what remained of the nation. It was a choice made under the shadow of abandonment, with the hope that surrendering the Sudetenland might buy time or at least spare the country from total annihilation. But as history would soon show, appeasement only delayed the inevitable. The loss of the Sudetenland shattered the country's morale, undermined its government, and left it vulnerable to further aggression. Within months, the rest of Czechoslovakia would fall, and the world would learn a harsh lesson about the dangers of giving in to tyranny. The question remains, could anything have changed the outcome, or was Czechoslovakia doomed from the start? The surrender of the Sudetenland was more than just a territorial loss. It was the unraveling of an entire nation. In the days that followed the Munich Agreement, Czechoslovakia's government was left reeling. its authority shattered and its people gripped by a sense of betrayal and despair. The withdrawal of Czechoslovak troops from the Sudetenland happened without a single shot fired, but the psychological wounds ran deep. For many, it felt as if the soul of the country had been ripped away. The Sudeten Germans, now under Nazi rule, celebrated their liberation, while Czechs and Slovaks mourned the loss of their homelands, integrity, and the collapse of the alliances they had trusted for protection. But the consequences didn't stop at the border. The loss of the Sudetenland meant the loss of vital fortifications, industrial centers, and natural defenses. Czechoslovakia was left exposed, its military power crippled, and its morale in ruins. The government, already weakened by internal divisions and the shock of betrayal, struggled to maintain control. In the months that followed, the country became a target for its neighbors. Hungary and Poland, sensing weakness, made their own territorial demands, and Czechoslovakia, abandoned by its former allies, was powerless to resist. The once proud republic was now a shadow of its former self, its fate hanging by a thread. Then, in March 1939, the final blow fell. Hitler, having promised at Munich that he had no further territorial ambitions, broke his word without hesitation. German troops marched into what remained of Czechoslovakia, occupying Prague and dissolving the republic entirely. The world watched in shock as the last remnants of Czechoslovak independence were swept away in a matter of days. The country was carved up, with Slovakia declared a puppet state and the Czech lands absorbed into the German Reich as the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The dream of a free and united Czechoslovakia was crushed, and the rest of Europe was left to grapple with the consequences of appeasement. The fall of Czechoslovakia sent a chilling message across the continent. It proved that promises made by aggressive powers could not be trusted, and that the policy of appeasement had only encouraged further aggression. The Munich Agreement, once hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, was now seen as a symbol of weakness and betrayal. For the people of Czechoslovakia, the sense of abandonment was profound. Their country had been sacrificed in the hope of preserving peace, but instead, it had only paved the way for greater conflict. Within 6 months, Hitler would invade Poland, and the world would be plunged into the horrors of World War II. The domino had fallen, and there was no turning back. The lesson was clear. When the world turns its back on justice and gives in to bullies, the cost is paid not just by one nation, but by all of humanity. Looking back, the story of Czechoslovakia's surrender in the face of German aggression is more than just a tale of lost territory or failed alliances. It's a haunting lesson about the dangers of compromise, the fragility of peace, and the unpredictable consequences of political decisions made under pressure. The world often remembers the Munich Agreement as a symbol of cowardice or betrayal, but the reality was far more complicated. Czechoslovakia was trapped in a web of impossible choices, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by friends, and torn apart from within by deep ethnic divisions. The leaders in Prague faced a nightmare scenario: fight a hopeless war alone, risking total destruction, or surrender in the hope of saving what little remained of their country. In the end, their decision was shaped by fear, pragmatism, and a desperate hope that appeasement might buy time or even prevent a greater catastrophe. But could it have been different? Some historians argue that if Czechoslovakia had chosen to resist, even in the face of overwhelming odds, it might have forced Britain and France to honor their commitments, or at least exposed Hitler's true intentions to the world sooner. Others believe that resistance would have led only to swift defeat and even greater suffering for the Czechoslovak people. What's clear is that the Sudetenland crisis was never just about borders or military strength. It was about the willingness of nations to stand up for their principles, and the devastating cost when they failed to do so. The world's leaders gambled on appeasement, hoping to avoid war by sacrificing a small nation, but in doing so, they only encouraged further aggression and set the stage for an even greater conflict. For the people of Czechoslovakia, the sense of abandonment and betrayal would linger for generations. Their story is a stark reminder that peace built on compromise with tyranny is always fragile, and that the price of ignoring injustice can be far higher than anyone expects. The fall of Czechoslovakia was not just the end of a country, it was the beginning of a tragedy that would engulf the entire world. As we reflect on these events, we're left with a question that still resonates today. When faced with aggression and injustice, is it better to fight against impossible odds or to yield in the hope of survival? History doesn't offer easy answers, but it does remind us that the choices we make in moments of crisis can shape the fate of nations and the world for generations to come. So what do you think? Was Czechoslovakia's surrender inevitable, or could a different choice have changed the course of history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the past that still echo in our world today.